So this week's twab is pretty big, like over 6,600 words big, and it's pretty good. So I decided instead of coil this week, I'll talk about the twab since it's largely PvP related. There's also a bunch of stuff that I have wanted and I feel are just generally super interesting. So getting into it, Mass Effect crossover is out, armor looks good. Hunter armor should have been Tally and not Garrus, but it's whatever. Armor is paid, Sparrow, Ship and Ghost you can just pick up in Eververse right now for free, and it's funny that the Titan's mark glitches out during the trailer. Ability tuning. They moved a couple things from Into the Light and Final Shape to the March patch. They realized that Threaded Spectre and Threadlink Spam is not fun, so they're adding the cooldown penalty and Ensnaring Slam to Threaded Spectre. According to D2 Clarity, that means it would be a 6-second longer cooldown, 12 if it stacks when using 6 Coyote. However, in PvE, Threaded Spectre will deal 25% more damage, and both Ensnaring Slam and Threaded Spectre seemingly will have the penalty reduced by 50%. They're also doing a bunch of PvP specific nerfs to Threadlings, increasing the aim's shape slightly, which is basically just your aim's hitbox size. They reduced their damage from 40 to 35 and 38.5 with Thread of Evolution on. Groups of Threadlings will now actually chain detonate and they'll no longer just blip out of existence. To compensate for the Threadling nerfs affecting Broodweaver largely, they moved some Arcane Needle buffs forward, which, to make it simple, just make it a bunch easier to hit people with. Finally, after a year, they fixed Restoration and Radiance duration being reset when running things like Ember of Mercy. To compensate for the amount of power Mercy and Empyrean want to have, Ember of Mercy grants 2 seconds of Restoration when picking up a Fire Sprite, and extends it by 2 seconds when picking up more of them. Ember of Empyrean will now let you gain up to 15 seconds of Restoration and Radiant, however the duration extension granted is dependent on what enemy type you kill. Miners and mages will grant less time than they do currently, but champs and mini-bosses will grant a bunch more. I honestly think it's a pretty fair change considering how overpowered they'll end up being with Restoration and Radiant actually fixed. Consecration will be a bit easier to hit now against targets in air and people further away. Gunpowder Gamble will only deal 80 self-damage instead of 144, so I might actually try using it now. Pretty decent ability changes, very glad about the Threadling stuff, it shouldn't really be a problem, especially with what will be mentioned a bit later. Weapon tuning stuff. Heavy burst hand cannon, so Water's Law, has had an issue where it had 25% less aim assist when firing hipfire or airborne on MK. It's now fixed. Bows finally got a nerf, basically just less aim friction at distance, a pure controller nerf, and less bullet magnetism, which will mostly be an MK nerf from what I'm understanding. Breakneck was meant to have target lock on it, but didn't, so that's now been actually added to the weapon. Lightweight 200 RPM scout rifles are now going to be a free crit run body, as they've gained a 5% damage increase. Sniper bullet magnetism was nerfed by 10%, which I think is entirely fair. The reason Sniper Rifle Flinch never works, I fully believe, is the work of how powerful bullet magnetism is, especially on keyboard and mouse, where I've hit some absolutely ridiculous shots through Flinch, so it'll be interesting to see if this actually makes a difference. Precision rocket launchers got 2 extra ammo and the damage penalty has been reduced from 10% to 5%, which according again to D2 Clarity puts them better than adaptives and aggressive rockets total damage wise, but will still lack the DPS. Especially considering we haven't got one since Witch Queen, so they won't have any modern perks, which is very important considering Bane's Witch is a perk that exists on basically every rocket launcher now. High Impacts also got 2 more reserves and will deal more detonation damage and less impact damage, which is funny considering what the frame is called. Again, according to D2 Clarity, this actually makes High Impacts the best for total damage and best general use due to their high blast radius and handling. Again, downside is perks, the high impact rocket changes will also apply to Deathbringer, Truth and Gallahorn as they are high impact rocket launchers. Heavy grenade launchers are getting some sizable buffs, depending on what grenade launcher you'll be using. It'll gain an extra 6 to 10 rounds. Spike Grenade's impact damage buff has been reduced from 50 to 12.5%, making it a 3% overall damage buff. However, the base impact damage of grenade launchers has been increased by 10%, which according to Bungie and a bit of math I did, makes it so normal grenade launchers are nearly as good as current spike grenade launchers are, but spike grenade launchers are slightly worse. By slightly worse, they mean by literally 1013.26 damage using numbers from D2 Foundry, which basically means they're doing the same damage as they were previously. However, it's just less mandatory. I also looked at mini frags after the change, and on Caraxis, the difference in damage is going to be 9,797.11 with mini frags and 10,359.5 with spike grenades. So mini frags is going to be a legitimate option next update. However, I'm sure people more knowledgeable than me will also do way more accurate testing, so I'd wait and see on that instead of just trusting me blindly. They also increased the detonation damage by 5%, which was mildly annoying to calculate, but on screen now should be the damage numbers for a bait-and-switch cataphract with spike grenades and no searches in March. It's also worth noting that bait-and-switch is going to be nerfed down to 30% instead of 35%, which is why Apex is there. Apex damage is also not taking into account Wolfpack rounds, which I am fairly certain that Apex and Cataphract would actually be about on par, both DPS and damage-wise, which is very interesting to see, as now for basically the first time since D1, we have two meta-heavy weapon options, assuming I am correct. Again, testing in March from people who are way more knowledgeable than me will come out basically immediately as the update drops, so keep a lookout for people like Aegis and Llama if you want more accurate information. Also increased wave frame heavy grenade launcher damage by 20%, and the wave itself is 40% wider. Caster frame swords only cost 4 ammo to do the heavy attack now and have 16% more damage. Vigilant swing now has a deterministic recoil pattern, and I pray it's good. Mythoclast has gotten yet another buff. It'll have the same ADS range scaler as 360 auto rifles do now, bringing its range up from 29.88 meters to 35.8 meters. Push-Ender finally got nerfed. True Sight will now deactivate if you leave ADS or hold the arrow for longer than 3 seconds, and apparently to reactivate it you have to fully redraw the bow. Hopefully this means it'll account for just pressing reload and insta-redrawing to get True Sight back up, but we'll see. Edge of Action's bubble was apparently getting destroyed way too easily, so now it has 85% damage resistance against all combatants apart from bosses, and 15% damage resistance against bosses. Manticore is getting a slight rework. You'll need to be in the air for half a second and deal damage in order to activate the thrusters. You can now deactivate the thrusters for a special reload, and they also added that to Taraba. Once the thrusters are engaged, combatants will be less accurate, and with the Catalyst, final blows and sustained damage with Manticore whilst airborne grant a overshield and return ammo to the magazine. Kind of sounds like it'll actually be a legitimately usable option now, but we'll see. On to perks, like I already mentioned, bait-and-switch will now be 30% instead of 35%. Heal Clip will grant Cure times 2 to the user and Cure times 1 to nearby allies. I honestly don't think that was the problem with the perk myself, more just the fact that it doesn't heal your shield if it's broken, which is more of a problem of Cure as a whole. So I don't know if it'll really affect anything, but I don't think it will. Not really for or against the change myself. Push Barrel can now be activated with ranged melees, which would be great for Solar Titans and Hunters, so I'm pretty happy about this. Barrel Constructor no longer deactivates upon firing shots in last 7.5 seconds, so presumably you'll just be able to run around with a 20% reduced pellet spread as long as you're chaining kills together. This change will now grant 20 aim assist and 20% reduced ADS movement speed penalty, in addition to its 50 reload increase. Dual Loader now has the reload speed penalty removed, and the description of the perk has now been reworded to state that it increases the number of shots reloaded, so they can put on other weapon types. In short, Dual Loader is going to be pretty good now, being effectively just double reload speed for shotguns and whatever else they put it on. Expellent Stock is getting a few buffs and now grants 20 range and 1.5 degree hipfire precision cone angle, in addition to its other effects. They're buffing the perk because they're adding a couple text weapons in the March update, alongside a few others, which in case you missed it, are the Prophet's a 120 stasis tech scout rifle, then the return of Summoner, a solar 600 RPM Cassioid auto, both from Trials, Tusk of the Boar, a strand waveframe grenade launcher, and the return of Morsimak, a 900 RPM kinetic SMG, both from Iron Banner and both have field tested. Wild Style, a solar double-fire text grenade launcher, and the Slammer, a stasis vortex frame sword, both from Nightfalls. To this week's twab, Hake Bridge Armaments, Deconstruct, and Sundering now work against Void Souls, Strand Clones, Cabal Shields, and Bricks. Hake Bridge Armaments deal 60% extra damage to stasis crystals down from 85% to match other construct perks. Sundering can now activate when breaking an enemy's shield, and deconstruct got fixed, so it will now activate when shooting a barricade, on top of the pack description being updated to show that it now pulls ammo from thin air. I can definitely recommend getting out a deconstruct Balisarius or even rewind deconstruct cold fronts if anyone other than me actually got that role. Hatchling got changed to now proc on either a precision kill or 3 non-precision kills, making it a bit easier to use. Target lock finally should be dead and now activates later on SMGs, meaning you wouldn't be able to get as much of a damage buff as you would now. So we should hopefully finally kill the SMG meta with this change. Envious Assassin will now only grant 100% of the magazine instead of 150% at maximum, and the maximum overflow is 3 times the magazine instead of 4 times. This was due to being able to get your entire heavy grenade launcher reserves into one magazine, and even though they don't mention it, likely Cold Comfort being able to fire 4 rockets back to back was also the reason for this change. The punch will now correctly deactivate after dealing melee damage with a powered melee, which will seemingly stop you from being able to melee twice with something like Banner of War Titan between every proc of 1-2 punch. They're seemingly going to be removing the mini boss debuff from major spec and putting it onto boss spec. The exact wording is, bonus damage against mini bosses should have been a part of boss spec, not major spec. We've updated these mods to correct that, so we'll see if that's the case. In the future, they are going to be rebalancing a bunch of weapon types in PvE, buffing underperforming options and leaving most of the high performance. They're also going to look at weapon mods which feel mandatory over the course of Final Shape's year. I mostly feel for PvE that's mainly just the spec mod, since that's really all you should be ever using anyway in PvE because it's just free damage. They also say they're going to be making substantial changes to several of the least used exotics, and adjusting some perks such as chocolate to make it more viable on lower RPM weapons. They also mentioned weapon enhancing, which is what the Row of Nightmares and Queers and Adept weapons have, where you can enhance their perks and customize barrel, mag, and masterwork, but have to level it up and use a bunch of materials in order to do so. So yeah, that's a pretty sizable twab on its own with some very good changes. I definitely want to see how good grenade launchers will be, how threadling spam, bows and SMGs will fare, and if Manticore will actually be any good. Like, at all. Bungie in general seem to be on the point of trying to make everything good, which is always a good thing. More options mean more people can just have more fun, and less things will be seen as just bad. And a good chunk of the twab is mainly targeting the lesser used options, which is quite nice. But there is still another section. Essentially, the current variation of Checkmate is going to be the standard Crucible mode when the March update drops. Firstly, before talking about it, I will outline what Bungie's reasons are for this. The goals of Checkmate are as follows: to help players more clearly understand the sequence of events that led to their death so that they can more easily learn how to improve. Also the weapon sandbox to account for the increased average skill of our player base by reducing the amount of high reward, low risk options. And finally, encourage primary and weapon mastery to be an aspirational pursuit for players. They then go on to explain how the current variation of Crucible is not reaching this goal. To directly quote the rest of their reasoning, as we've increased the prevalence and strength of some sandbox elements, the ability to clearly understand what is happening from a target's perspective has suffered. It is increasingly common to be defeated instantly or so quickly that there is no time to react. And often so many different things are happening that it's nearly impossible to determine the sequence of events that killed you. The defeated player has difficulty recognizing and reacting to how they were defeated. It creates a situation where it feels like there was nothing they could have done, making it hard to learn what to do better next time. It also places a strong focus on being the one to deliver as many of these types of unreadable kills as possible, while utilizing build crafting to avoid becoming the recipient. Then sandbox elements that do not benefit either of those paths fall out of favour. Additionally, while the average skill of our players has crept up over the years, the weapons sandbox has not grown alongside it. For example, a much higher percentage of our players can hit optimal time to kill with SMGs, Pikachu with hand cannons, or Blint with Wish Ender today than could several years ago. In large part, this is because a certain amount of forgiveness was baked into many primary weapons, to allow more players to utilize them at their full potential. For example, high reward weapons like precision SMGs or aggressive frame hand cannons, only requiring 67% critical hits to achieve optimal time to kill, and Wish Ender, allowing you to follow up the bow swap with a body shot from a hand cannon. This leniency allows players to make mistakes and still benefit from the full strength of the playstyle. This made sense when the average player skill was lower, but in the current ecosystem, a far larger number of players can take advantage of those benefits. This is manifesting itself in multiple places, but is most notable in the significant compression of the skill gap at high levels of play. An additional byproduct is an increase in difficulty for new players finding their footing in a game where many veteran players have near mastery of these existing playstyles, which increases the friction of refreshing the pool of players in the Crucible. Finally, at high levels of play, things like high body shot damage, generous aim assist, primary weapon flinch, and low critical hit requirements all contribute to the feeling that putting in the time to improve your skill with a primary weapon is generally not worth the effort. With many meta primary weapons, hitting optimal or near optimal time to kill is less representative of mastery of the weapon and is instead merely an expectation of standard play. Similarly, at lower levels of play, players can still lose relatively quickly to an inaccurate opponent, which minimizes the time they have to figure out the sandbox and learn, often making them feel like they are playing higher skill players than they really are. Back to me for a second. This is basically something I would just largely agree with. There have been many a time where I find myself in a situation where I question what I actually could have done differently, and am met with no way to actually figure that out. It has always been an aspect of Destiny that has not really been a thing in any other game I've played, which can make improvement very frustrating. To continue with what Bungie was saying, these symptoms are all generated by a handful of root causes, each generally linked to the others in a circular balance that encourages us to touch all of them at once if we're making big changes, or in smaller increments if we're modifying things individually. We have certain ability builds with higher uptime or higher potency than we believe is healthy. To keep those builds in check, we have provided a near constant availability of special armor, which means there is always a surplus of one-shot kill weapons on the field, and to keep primary weapons competitive, we have made primary weapons highly lethal, fast killing, and in general, very forgiving. All that leads to a high percentage of deaths in our sandbox, where, from the target's perspective, it feels like there was nothing they could have done differently. Simply put, we have a risk versus reward problem. Over time, we push some of our sandbox elements to have higher rewards without offsetting them with the risk of punishing suboptimal play. Some elements take it a step further. Instead of just rewarding the attacker, they punish the target. For example, explosive payload hand cannons flinch and Wish Ender's true sight. The last part was basically just a TLDR version of the paragraph before it. Again, I feel it is incredibly accurate to the current Crucible experience. However, that last part kind of brings up problems with Checkmate as a whole. Checkmate in its current form has the major issue of there being certain things that lack direct counters, at least to my knowledge, or at least significantly harder to counter. Titan, for example, with lower body shot damage will likely take more shots to kill, alongside the fact that a barricade will just take more shots to kill in general, because they can only take body shot damage. On top of the lack of abilities on both sides, meaning neither really has an ability they could use to fix either issue, and the super changes could cause a point where bubble becomes even more mandatory in trials, due to being the only super that can probably be up on a final round, and be completely uncounterable without conditional finality or with a horde ammo. This is on top of things like team shooting, which yes is far easier to deal with in Checkmate than it was previously, but significantly harder to deal with than it is in current PvP, which can slow the game down to an absolute snail's pace, and make things very unfun to play. So I don't really know what to think about it currently. I enjoyed Checkmate during Crucible Labs, the current version anyway, and it was fine in trials, but I literally couldn't get any wins. Admittedly, I played pretty poorly and it was a bad weekend overall, so obviously I shouldn't be handed free wins, that's not what I'm saying. But it was still slightly discouraging. So yeah, I guess I just gotta wait and see how things play out. I do think Checkmate fixes a lot of the issues with the sandbox as a whole, and provides a more competitive game. But it does have some, I want to say, quite blatant problems that I feel are just being shoved to the wayside. I also saw people saying they'd want free hit kill melees back, and I really do not think that is a good idea at all. Not only does it make melee basically useless, it also further encourages just sitting back and team shooting as primary fights less than 5 meters away, are incredibly awful and just feel bad to do. And they have to massively buff close-range hipfire accuracy to really get away with it, in my opinion. So on top of the issue that makes people want free melees in the first place, being that melee connection is awful, it would just be even worse, as now you would need to have free melees to kill someone, which is someone who likes using glaives. Even they suffer from it, and they have actually decent melee hit detection. So if anyone wants to explain that point to me, just go ahead. Honestly, I'm honestly curious why that's just a thing people want. Also forgot to write this down, but the original checkmates will also be returning in March for the people who want it. And yeah, that's all I gotta say. I promise Coil video will be next week unless something else big comes up. Like, comment, sub as usual, and adios.
Virginia!